What's up, everyone? Welcome back for another episode of the FCL podcast. It was an exciting week with some bigger matchups that took place. Coach Rafis was dynamite on the broadcast for the Vermont and Towson games in the Dome. The first women's weekend was fantastic, and there were some big performances on the men's side, and Hopkins and Syracuse are both humming. This past Sunday, we launched our Coach's Corner newsletter. We are now putting out 3 newsletters that I hope our listeners subscribe to and enjoy. Welcome to the show today as we get into week 2, some notable performances, and some new segments today. I'm joined by my co-hosts Stephen Rafis and Matt Dunn. Welcome to the show, fellas. Matt, take us through today's segments.
Awesome. Thank you, Deemer. We have a new format going on this week where we are introducing some segments to help organize the show and to bring in some interesting topics that we want to hit throughout the podcast. Our first segment going to be led by Stephen Rafis is our 2-minute drill. Then we get into GPUs, which are games, players, and units. Hot topics is after that. Then we'll get into the breakdown where we break down interesting concepts and trends that we see in the game that we think is something, we really want to focus on. Then we'll look ahead into next weekend, looking at some matchups in the men's and women's side that we want to highlight, think are interesting, and are looking forward to watching. And lastly, we'll wrap it up with our players' perspective, where we'll dive into some topics that we think are interesting for the players that listen to it, for our athletes, the players we coach, is trying to share our experiences and give them some thoughts and advice as they head into their high school seasons. So that's a quick overview of the segments. We'll see how they go. We'll hit them. And now we're going to kick it off with Stephen Rafis taking the lead with our 2-minute drill, running us through this past weekend.
Maryland 8, Loyola 7, an overtime win for Maryland, who only had 2 goals going into the fourth quarter. Hopkins beat Georgetown 11-6. UNC with a huge season opening win, 15-6 over Michigan. Delaware, big game there, beat Utah 13-12. And Syracuse had the Monday night game winning 18-7 over Towson. Some notable performances, so some individual guys that stood out. 4 guys a part of the 10-point club this week. From Syracuse, Joey Spallina with 10 points against Vermont. He went 5-5. Marquette, Nolan Rappis, 10 points versus Detroit Mercy, also 5-5. From Lafayette, Riley Sullivan, 10 points versus Binghamton. And from St. John's, Adrian Nowak, 10 points versus NJIT. Some other guys that stood out to us. Utah, Ryan Stein, 7 points versus Delaware. Sacred Heart, Tucker Spencer, 7 goals versus St. Joe's. UNC, Owen Duffy, 6 points versus Michigan. UVA, Truett Sunderland with a huge day, 9 points versus Colgate. And also have to shout out Ben Weyer, the LSM, 2 goals and 1 assist against Colgate. For Providence, Ryan Bell continues to be one of the best feeders in the country with 7 points against Bryant, going 1-6. From Army, Jackson Eicher, 8 points versus UMass. And lastly, Syracuse, Owen Hiltz on Monday night, 7 points versus Towson. He went 3-4.
Wow. Efficient. Nice job, Stephen. And as Deemer mentioned in the intro, anybody that hasn't been watching the Syracuse game, Stephen has been on the broadcast, and I think doing a phenomenal job. I texted him last night. Just the coverage of the game, the way he presents himself, it's not always easy to do that. So we're honored to have him here running our 2-minute drill. Having 4 people in the 10-point club is a pretty big week for points across the board, huh?
I think it's interesting just thinking back to, 10 years ago, our time in college, obviously pre-shot clock. So the amount of guys that are registering 6, 7, 8 points on a consistent basis, just continues to increase just because teams are playing faster and they're forced to get shots off. I'll be very curious when, just call it 5 years from now, seeing what people are finishing up career points wise compared to, the prior, decade or so. Obviously, you'll have to take out some people that maybe were 5th or 6th years and also look at it from a games played. But I think you can also, use the points per game metric to, normalize some of that data. I'll just be curious to see how that shakes out.
Games played is always an interesting debate, and some teams that front load their schedule. I used to chirp Deemer that Duke used to do that, but I guess now Syracuse has 3 games already, and it's only February 13th. So
the ones that would be focused on that are the Cuse crowd. So,
oh my God.
It's not these players' fault necessarily who they're playing or how many games they're playing, right? So I think you got to give credit where credit's due when they have good games. But then as you get down the stretch and you start really trying to assess all American teams, Tourton list, and those conversations, I think you do factor in the reality of the quality of those points, who they're playing against, when the points come. So I don't think points in February are worth the same as points in April and May. I think you guys would agree. But nonetheless, for where we are, you don't blame these players for their schedules and who they're playing against. These guys are producing. And so I just like looking at the sheet, seeing 4 players with 10 points and then another list of guys with 6, 7, and 8 points. And some of those guys have done it in very impressive fashions. I think it's a cool note for week 2 here.
I forgot one game. We were recording this on Thursday morning, February 13th. Last night, Notre Dame played their first game. Chris Kavanaugh, 9 points. Jake Taylor, 7 points. Just wanted to shout those two out as well.
7 for 9 shooting too from Taylor. I'd love, and I think this is, we should save this for another show, Matt, but ways to neutralize an elite off-ball guy. Obviously he's pretty smart in the pick game too, so he can go get involved and mix it up. But, you can't leave that guy for 2 yards on the crease, so he just makes you pay. So it's just, I'll be very curious. And, again, talk about maybe some lighter games to start the season. I think, hey, Kavanaugh going 1-3 in the first couple possessions, quarterbacking, carrying the ball. Steven, I know you had that, not doubt, but just more like a question of like eager to see him take that QB role. Obviously, exciting start for them to see that happen, and Faison not play.
We'll save Notre Dame's offense for a little bit later as they get more games under their belt. But I just think even breaking things down like Jake Taylor, there's so many. You can't really look at him in isolation. And it's the same thing with like a Syracuse offense. You can't look at those pieces that are generating a lot of points for them in isolation because they benefit off the other parts. It's all the machine working together and the dominoes falling. So the ability for one guy to dodge a certain way and for 2 players to cut a certain way and for somebody to space a certain way allows for the other guy to optimize and to capitalize on these plays in a certain way. So I think it's kind of looking at it all together. I think for Taylor, he's just a guy that finds soft space so well. There's great chemistry with him and Kavanaugh and those other guys. And I think for him, it's not, you can't X and O's cover him. You have to be check ready. Like you just have to be ready for when that ball comes in to slash his stick out of his hands. And I think I watched some of the highlights last night. There's guys on and around Jake Taylor, but Kavanaugh knows when he's open. He just sees a stick head and can put it in that spot. And he can read defensive body language as to whether or not somebody's going to check him or not before the ball gets there.
Guys, last thing I'd say before we move on to GPUs, and again, I think this might be a later season hot topic discussion, but when it comes down to the 10-point club stuff, Steven knows when it translates to All-Americans and that debate. I think we had a discussion in the car a couple months ago about the whole playing attack for fast breaks, but then being considered a midfielder. And that's always been one of my biggest gripes because I'm like, man, I would have loved to, get an extra 10 to 20 points playing every fast break and then being able to bump up to the midfield and then still be considered a midfielder. So I don't know how, people saw past that when a lot of that was happening, but that'll be something that we can debate more later in the season.
Yeah, people refuse to switch that, and I don't understand why. Like if someone has midfield in their bio, and maybe they've been traditionally a midfielder, but then junior and senior year, they're down at attack, especially on fast breaks. They're on the field all the time. Like you're in
attack. That's all that it matters is fast breaks. It's like you play fast breaks and then you play above goal line. Like if you play fast breaks, you're getting at least another step down or 2 opportunity a game, and you're getting the easiest assists in the game.
Yeah, probably a discussion for another time. Deemer, you would have been on the low left spot though, so...
Hey, I would have been floating up the wing for the skips.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on here. All right, first segment, nice job. Segment 2 is GPUs. We have our games, our players, and our units. The idea here is each of us can highlight up to, however many we see fit, games that we thought were interesting and want to talk about from the past weekend, players we thought stood out, or units that we thought had a great weekend. Could be, a close defense, could be an attack unit, could be a rope unit, a man up, man down unit, a coaching staff if we deem it fit. maybe even a ref staff if they're really killing it. But we're moving on here. Deemer, you're going to take the first crack. Why don't you give us a run through any games, players, and units that you think stood out to you this weekend?
Well, first off, from a game perspective, I think Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, and not as much, I would say, surprised from a Georgetown perspective, more impressed from a Hopkins perspective. I think even thinking about the different units, I think defense was suffocating. I think they were confrontational on ball. I thought they rotated well. I think their poles fly around. Luke Stout is impressive in cage. Like, he's a guy the last couple of weeks who's just made some really nice saves. And I thought even Georgetown had several man up opportunities, and there weren't easy goals to be had. So, he impresses me in the cage, which we know that is huge come May. And then I think offensively, again, stay on the lookout for more breakdowns and content that we put on about the Hopkins offense, because they're swinging the ball well. They're initiating. Matt Collison is playing with the physicality and the confidence of a first-team All-American midfielder. Chauvet is lethal from the lefty wing, and their initiators, their party starters, are playing really well and facilitating great ball movement. So there's not one unit for me to pick out, and that's why, just from a game perspective, I think Hopkins also winning that game after their past couple wins, Denver and Towson. So that's been impressive to me. And I'm eager to keep watching them, in the coming up weeks. Player, Eric Spanos down the stretch for Maryland. I think I had him at 3 fourth quarter goals. It might've been maybe a first half goal, a third quarter, and 2 in the fourth. But he, to me, really stepped up with his size and physicality and turned the corner a couple times. Nice placement on the shots, and to score 4 goals out of, I think, 8 for Maryland, including a couple big ones down the stretch. He's a guy that I thought stood out and really, led like an upperclassman. And then unit on the women's side, I was really impressed with Boston College defensively. Top 10 matchup going against Loyola. Loyola has a couple stars in Georgia Latch and Chase Boyle, who will be, a very likely candidate again for midfielder of the year. And they really neutralized those players. They used a combination of face guards, quick slides, strategic slides to certain spots on the field. They just were flying around. And why it's also so impressive, they're playing several young players in their lineup. Caitlin Cole, a girl that we've gotten to know over the years, out of the Port Washington, Garden City area. She was in the starting lineup. Devin Russell is starting at midfield as a freshman out of New Canaan. And they just, to be able to support Shea Baker and some of their other more senior laden players with some really talented, coachable young players and fly around, they just had a really impressive home victory against Loyola.
I've been particularly impressed by Hopkins this year on the men's side as a team. I think they show, it's early in the season. You almost wonder if this is a good or bad thing. They show a lot of maturity as a full team in February, where I think across the board, they have a ton of talent, but I think they play really hard and they play well together. And I think, that's something that they have some good leadership. I think Scott Smith's a guy that really stands out consistently on the defensive end. They play really hard. I think the way they play stands out a lot. I'm wondering your guys' impression on where Hopkins stands right now based off of what they were last year, which I thought was a really good team that, lost to UVA in the playoffs, and what they've shown so far this year. They have a ton of firepower, but I think it's more than just talent for them. I think they have some type of mojo, some character that seems to be kind of showing itself in the way they play each weekend.
Yeah, I just think they're tested so early from going all the way out to Denver and then turning around and playing a team like Towson so quickly again. And, I was able to catch a good amount of that game, and it was sloppy, I think, on both sides, but just Hopkins being able to get that done was very impressive to me after that travel. Their schedule has really no easy games. They've got Loyola, UNC, Virginia, Syracuse as their next four. But then from watching, I guess, their offense play, I've just been impressed with how unselfish they are. Really caught a lot of those clips against Denver. So like what I'm seeing there. But overall, great start for Hopkins.
Yeah, I think the only thing that, unfortunately for them, I think comes up when you think about Hopkins is, and I would put Syracuse in this category too, the program has had so much historical success. The landscape across multiple teams now has gotten deeper and more competitive. So I just think as an alumni base, looking from the outside, an alumni base that is so used to winning and going to Final Fours and championships, it's great that they look this good in February, but like I almost think, unfortunately, no one's really going to care until they get back to the Final Four, and again, those Elite Eight games are so difficult, and you're getting Virginia's, you're getting Duke's, Notre Dame's, Maryland's, you name it, consistently year over year. That that's ultimately what they're working for, and again, I think as an internal team, you can feel really good about where you're getting and how it feels, and that's what you have to focus on, is the process of that. When you're an outsider, you're kind of like, again, we're not trying to come on here the February 13th, 14th weekend and make these crazy bold statements, because I think we've all been in the mix and in the fire where we know how what happens in May is so different than what happens in February.
100%. Yeah, it's an effort in vain to try to predict that, but I think just the take of what it is for what it is right now, that is a team that I've been impressed with, and it's a pretty complete team, it seems like. And Georgetown, I thought Georgetown played pretty good defense throughout. I think Hopkins' defense kind of flustered them, and Hopkins was good in the cage, but Georgetown played good defense. Hopkins scored some really impressive goals. They scored in a 10-man ride. They scored some early offense. Chalvet had that one where like Georgetown played great defense, but kind of caught it cutting through the defense, ran through a few checks and shot it like low to high, fading away. They just kind of found ways to score, which I think is what a great team does. And they found ways to get stops, which I think is what a great team does. So obviously early in the season, just kind of a first take there. Steven, do you want to run us through your games, players, and or units here?
Yes. So today I only have a game and a player, no unit for me today. From a game perspective, the one that stood out to me was UNC Michigan. I think we talked about it a little bit last week on the call, just excited to see what UNC looked like. They walked away with this one with a 15-6 win, which is just a huge start. Also a big win for the ACC over Big Ten. We have another ACC Big Ten matchup this weekend that we'll talk about a little bit later in Syracuse and Maryland. But taking a look at this game, one thing that stood out to me was just the knowns showing up, right? Owen Duffy, 4 goals, 2 assists. Dom Petramala, 4 goals, 1 assist, right? That's always good that those guys, are jumping out to have such a great start to the year, especially Duffy, who went down with an injury at the end of last year. So that's nice to see. Then you take a look, at the goalie perspective. UNC landed the Princeton grad transfer in Michael Gianfrancaro. He went 67% in his first game with UNC, which I think is a great start for him. And then the faceoff perspective, Brady Wambach, who I believe is now a sophomore, he went 55%, but the backup Parker Hoffman also went 67%. It has just become increasingly important to have 2 face-off guys, right? Especially with the violation rules, which they haven't changed a ton in terms of if you violate that, another face-off man has to go in the next time. But there just isn't as much of a repercussion anymore with no flag being thrown. So I'm just really impressed with UNC, excited to see their progression this season and what they look like. I know a lot of people have been counting them out, and they've had 500 seasons the past 2 years or so. So nice to see them get started there, and like I said, nice to see the knowns kind of get involved early. From a player's perspective, I wanted to just discuss, I know he gets all the headlines all the time, but Joey Spallina and his dominance against mid-majors. I think it's no secret that he has faced a lot of criticism for the fact that he can score multiple goals and have assists and points, etc., against mid-majors and not like the biggest games necessarily, not to throw shade at any of these other teams. But you take a look at, a game against Vermont where he has 10 goals. And I knew as I logged on to Twitter or into, any text that I'm getting exactly what's going to be said. I'm like, okay, yeah, like we've seen it before. Like do it against, Maryland next weekend, or do it in, the NCAA quarterfinals. I did just want to highlight though the difficulty of scoring 8, 9, 10 points in a game, and regardless of who you're playing against, like at the college level, that is just incredibly impressive. He's already obviously had a 10-point game this year. If I look back at his sophomore season, he had 7 against Vermont, 9 against Colgate, 10 against Manhattan, 9 against High Point. Like I really have not seen a player, in my time that has been so dominant like this against some of the mid-majors. So I did just want to discuss that a little bit. Look, I think Joey's ultimately just going to be judged on how he performs on the biggest stages. He's a huge social media presence. He wears 22. His family's all throughout the lacrosse world. So it's just like an interesting dynamic that continues to unfold. But the other thing is like he's only a junior. Like he has 2 years left. He and his class hit the ground running at Syracuse right away with all getting playing time just because of kind of the influx of players that left and that then came in. So he's just had that scrutiny for so long. And, as he continues to get older and play against guys his age too, right? Like it's different when you're a freshman going against juniors and seniors when then you're a junior going against juniors or a senior going against a sophomore defender. I think he looks really good right now. I've also been impressed just with his like stamina. I said that on the broadcast. He looks like he lost a little bit of weight, looks a little bit more agile. Every time that ball's going out on the end line, he's running back there to get it. So just a guy, excited to see what that looks like for him, and just wanted to give the shout out of, hey, I know he's scoring 10 points in the games that aren't the biggest, but still pretty impressive to be putting up the numbers that he is.
My thoughts when I was watching the Vermont game and some of those highlights as well is that he's scoring those points so easily that he's actually being criticized for that. But what you have to do a deeper layer, search to figure out is, hey, like he's making it look so easy because of how smart he is as a player, and he shouldn't be penalized for that just because, I think people struggle with that and then they want to compare it to, some of the top teams. He's getting defenders hung up intentionally. He plays so well around the pipes that's why he gets such easy goals. And if you're an attackman that's not putting up these points, you should be studying what he does to be like, man, like I could score more points too if I didn't rely only on my 1v1 dodging. And I think that's what, he's like, doesn't make sense to me why he's getting criticized for that, because he just at the end of the day is making it look so effortless. So I just think that's really impressive by him. I think when he makes his feeding decisions, he puts passes on the money that his scorers can capitalize on more often than not. So throwing catchable, scoreable balls is another, skill that he has, whether it's behind the back, sidearm, around a defender. And that results in more points, So I just think some of the things that he's doing to register these points are also not your run of the mill skills that most people think about when it comes to dodging, shooting, scoring. And so that's kind of why it's harder for people to appreciate, the things that he's doing. And then, think about how many kids as freshmen or sophomores are registering 6 to 10 points against, the Marylands of the world and some of these top defenders. If he's neutralized by them game planning for him so hard and he lets other people take over and put points on the board, like, so be it. I think that also would just speak to his character and wanting to win, more than just register the points. So, I'm a fan and I'm excited to see how the season keeps unfolding for him.
Yeah, those are great takes. I think we tend to all be a little more empathetic on the player side of things just because we can all relate to it. And I'm not going to say fair or unfair because I think that's a tough word, but there's a lot of pressure on Joey. The reality is he is a sophomore and he's been very productive. Deemer, your point reminds me a lot of that Messi video of him scanning the field where it shows his like basically his vision, where his eyes look at on the field, and how intentional his movements are. So it might not look like he's doing a lot, but he's so productive every time he does something. And so I think, to your point, just because a guy makes something look easy, well, why doesn't everybody have 10 points then? Well, because everybody's not that skilled. You can't just plug anybody at X attack on Syracuse and have them produce these numbers. So I think we know, and I think we're trying to highlight is we're not sitting here saying, best player in the world, but the guy, Joey's done a lot of really good things. He's extremely talented, and he makes hard things look easy. And there's a lot more that goes into being able to get these assists, to being able to get these goals. A lot of guys think like dodging is waiting in the corner, catching it and running. There's this whole art to moving and flowing and reading spacing and the angle of the attack, and when to attack, and when to deceptively draw a slide to throw the ball, and when to try to bait no slide so you can dodge. And I think he puts on a masterclass with a lot of those things of the before the dodge, of setting up the dodge. And I think defensively, we talk about the same thing. Winning a matchup is not just, ready, set, go, dodge. It's getting out to the ball at the right way, at the right angle, at the right time, so you can force the dodge to happen on your terms. And I think it's hard to see that a lot. But when you watch these really good defenders and these really good dodgers, what they do is they win that before the ball gets to them scenario to put themselves in an advantageous position. When the ball gets there, they're at a better position to attack or defend.
I think you're spot on. And just my last note on it, like, I think for him to get ultimately into that conversation of a Chris Kavanaugh, CJ Kirst, like those two guys, I think are a bit ahead right now. Just have to see this continued aggression and skill set just against these bigger teams, these more big time defenders. So excited to see that. And, he's going to be tested with their whole schedule. So looking forward to seeing how that all unfolds.
Awesome. All right. I'll wrap us up here. Games, players, and unit. I have all three. My game of the week is Delaware versus Utah. I flipped it on going into the second half. It was 7-7 at halftime. And this was honestly one of the more entertaining games I've ever watched. I have one of our good friends, Casey Capinos, is on the Delaware coaching staff, a player. I've coached Liam Powell, a freshman defender that's starting at Delaware. I know a few of the other guys on the team. So I really wanted to just kind of watch that game. And Utah obviously made some noise with their big win against Ohio State, a very talented team. And this game really didn't disappoint at all, and could be early contention for game of the year, just the way it all went down. At halftime, it was tied up. It was 7-7 in the third quarter. Delaware was up 9-8 at the end of the third quarter, and it was 12-11 Delaware with 2 minutes left. And this game was back and forth, like trading goal for goal pretty much the entire time. Utah calls a stick check on Delaware's faceoff guy, I believe. You can kind of see the refs take the stick. They turn it fully upside down. The ball doesn't come out. And this is a faceoff guy, so we know how those sticks work. So Delaware gets a 3-minute non-releasable penalty. Utah scores to tie it up on the first man up, and then Delaware scores a man down goal. It was Bennett Palmer who had his fourth goal, that's going to be one of my players, by the way. And just like an insane back and forth game, extremely entertaining. So one, I would highly recommend, like if you want to go watch the YouTube highlights, just a really good game overall there. Between Delaware and Utah. That was Delaware's first game of their season too, so a big win for them. As far as my players go, I mentioned Bennett Palmer, freshman, had 4 goals for Delaware, including the man down goal to put them up 1. So just a first game, freshman, huge performance there, a big win to start off against Utah. He was a guy that I think deserves a shout out. My second player of the weekend is Remy Reynolds. Defender for Loyola, number 29. Remy was defensive player of the week in the Patriot League. He had 5 calls, turnovers, 4 ground balls, and a goal against Maryland. If you watch that tape, he is all over the field. Number 29. We posted a clip of him getting a can opener, turnover, picking it up, running the field, and scoring. He is just wreaking havoc. And if you look at kind of the end result of that game, he was a big piece of just making those Maryland offensive players uncomfortable. Maryland was able to string a few together at the end, but it was an 8-7 overtime game. And if you watch that game, Remy Reynolds was a guy that I thought was very, very impressive. Deemer, I know last week, I believe you talked about motor. Like, this guy had motor. He is chasing guys, not getting out of position. The ball's on the ground. He is hunting the ball. He's pressuring hands as guys are trying to feed. An extremely impressive performance by him. My last piece here, just to build off of that, is my unit is Loyola's long poles. Once again, took Maryland to overtime, really low scoring game. It, held Maryland to 3 or 4 goals through the first 3 quarters, I believe, until Maryland was able to string a few together. Obviously, Maryland was able to finish it and get the win, but I thought these long poles for Loyola just made the offense's job hard. And what I think they did really well was they're a little unorthodox, but they're very deceptive. So really good at hedging, kind of snapping back, really good at playing with sticks in the lanes. When they slide, they're just like stick pressure on the ball. And they do a really good job of that. So just making guys uncomfortable. And you could probably put part of the onus on Maryland's offense and part of it, the value of the Loyola's defense created by putting pressure on them. But it just seemed like those guys weren't comfortable and were turning the ball over because of the pressure Loyola's poles put on them. They just looked composed. They didn't look afraid. They played really hard. And to me, that's like a cultural thing at Loyola. I remember going there back in my freshman year, 2013, and that was like Scott Ratliff's year and the year right after they had won the championship. Just reminded me of what I feel like Loyola has culturally, which is a defensive unit that plays really hard, maybe isn't always the top talent, but they either systematically or culturally are able to make it hard on other teams and put pressure on them. And I feel like that Maryland-Loyola game has always been a big one.
I think the Loyola defense has always had that certain grit and identity, and just the toughness, they're disruptive. It's guys like Joe Fletcher. He wasn't like the biggest like takeaway guy, but he was just a pest, always in your hands. I'm blanking on some of the D middies besides Hawkins that would have played. Laconey.
Yeah.
Laconey was a beast. And some of those guys, so I just think like they've always had that identity, they've had that consistency, in their coaching staff for so long.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think guys too that, probably on the whole are, more under recruited, under the radar, maybe don't get the same kind of attention. And, they come in and play with that chip on their shoulder.
Peyton Rozanka, also a PLL guy, now was Loyola, demitted the last few years. Another shout out there. I think Coach Toomey, Coach Dwan, Coach Van Arsdale, we've talked about them, consistent staff. They get the most out of their guys. I think they've instilled a culture of grit and a lot of those in how they do things. And I think it shows when they play.
I wanted to give a shout out too. You were mentioning Bennett Parmer as your player. When I saw the last name, I was like, that last name looks familiar. And hey, maybe that's a Delaware, in-home, in-state player. And his sister, Olivian, actually came to Best in Class this past year. She's committed to UNC. She's a 2026, really talented player. I think parents played football and field hockey at JMU. So it runs in the family for sure.
Nice. Good shout out there. That the Wilmington, Delaware to the Blue Hens connection, that whole area of the corner. Great area of the country. All right, moving on to our next segment here. This one should be quick, to the point, hot topics. Idea here is we all share a few things that we just think are interesting and topical. Can be anything. I'll do the honor share kicking us off just because I was the only one to put together a list for this. And then I think you guys might have a few to add. Hot topics for me, the Ivy League. The Ivy League starting up this week. 3 of the Ivy League teams are top 10, I believe, in a poll. And I think a number of the other ones are right behind them. So you got Cornell, Princeton, Yale are going to be opening up, coming up this week. And so just seeing where the Ivy League stands pretty much for me. I think a great year. Everybody's expecting a lot. Cornell has been a team that a lot of people have been talking about their offense, about the potential for them to be a finalist this year in the NCAA tournament. So excited to see how the Ivy League performs as they begin to open up here in February. Next hot topic is Syracuse's offense, putting up points like crazy. I think even more impressive than the points is just each of the pieces and how difficult they seem to cover. I know they're not perfect, but I think the firepower they have is unreal. And lastly, I have Maryland's schedule. So Maryland has played Richmond and Loyola so far. Really close overtime win against Loyola, but now they have Syracuse, Princeton, Notre Dame, Delaware, then Virginia, Michigan, and into Big Ten play. So really if you look at the schedule preseason, maybe Loyola was supposed to be their easier game. And you can maybe argue Delaware too, but Loyola went into overtime and Delaware is a really good team. And around that, you have pretty much top 10, top 15 teams that they're playing consistently. So that's one, as a Maryland alum fan myself, that I have my eye on.
So the one that really stuck out to me, scrolling through Twitter, there was a tweet from at Brian Knows Lax, and essentially it was a clip of Joey Spallina coming off of a goal line pick. Finn Thompson does a really nice job of adjusting his pick, getting in the way of the defender. There's a hedge, and he throws back to Thompson for a dunk. And, his sentiment was, this is a perfect example of Spallina attacking his pull matchup. He sets his defender up, knowing that he was going to make that pass to Finn as soon as he started the dodge. And I just kind of, the tweet got a lot of traction, but then I also saw Jack Hanna in the comments, with the sentiment around, it was a great read and not a pre-dodge choice. So I think it's something that, to me, in terms of a hot topic, it's a very interesting take both ways, but I definitely tend to side on, one, knowing Spallina and how he operates. There's a difference between having a scout and an expectation of what the defense might do, and the other side of it being that you're predetermining your reads and your plays, but when the dodge starts or when something is happening in the very beginning. And so, I think for players or coaches that are seeing that tweet and seeing, some of that sentiment, I personally believe, and I think you guys would be the same, that, the best players in the college game are, the ones that are making the decisions as they read the defense. They might have information or intel that might lead them to that decision ahead of time, but that's all part of taking in that information, seeing what the defense is giving you, and then being able to execute without thinking about it, and letting your training and your decision-making skills really come out on the field. And so I just think that's an important differentiation to make, versus him saying, hey, I'm going to automatically hit that throwback because I know that Towson's going to get fumbled up in the pick. I just don't think you can play like that.
It might be sometimes people mean the same thing and use different terminology, but I do think trying to clarify the terminology is important, because when you coach players, a lot of them do try to predetermine, hey, if I go off, then I do this if he does this. But the reality is there's too much fluidity and grayness in the game. And so Joey probably knew, once again, those guys probably have chemistry, because I watched that play and I was like, I bet they've done this a million times. And Joey knows that if the guy hedges too far, the slip's going to be there, and vice versa, knowing that the slip guy has to be ready for the ball because they have that chemistry, right? But to just say, I'm going to run off this pick because I know Towson's going to jump it, and then the slip will be there. If that is the intention, I don't even know if that's exactly what was intended with it. I think we all know that nobody has that foresight. You can probably assume if I run really hard off this and the guy starts to yank a little too far and follow me, slip's going to be there.
With the Utah-Delaware game, I just wanted to comment on, I believe it was Utah that called for the stick check on the Delaware Fogo. I just wanted to briefly talk about, because Twitter was all over it, a lot of my group chats were all over it, calling a stick check on a Fogo and what that looks like. A lot of people were ripping it. I think if I'm a coach that's calling a stick check on a Fogo, then I better be ready for my Fogo to also be called for a stick check, maybe from the opposing coach or someone. So I think it's just an interesting line that a lot of people in lacrosse don't want to cross, because I think the face-off sticks can always become pretty illegal with how warped they are. So I just wanted to shout out, I guess, that debate. And yeah, basically say that if my player got stick checked, I don't know the exact rule, but I would then stick check the opposing Fogo right away.
The Fogo stick check is a pretty wild one, but I mean, it's kind of that gray area where I just don't think a lot of coaches will do it. it is mutually assured destruction. It should be, if you call a Fogo stick check, it should be all face-off sticks come out at the same time.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
should need to be tested.
The net minutes assigned based on how many illegal sticks are
Yeah,
on the sideline.
it offsets. It's well, in that same regard, I believe this one too was, I saw the ref flip the stick upside down and the ball didn't come out, like totally horizontal with the ground. And it may have been legal before the game because we know how those sticks kind of work. So I honestly don't know, as a face-off guy, if how to manage that. It's one thing if your stick is too short, right? That's not going to change from facing off. But I think a lot of the other head warping stuff, I was thinking that same thing. I was like, it's a bold move. But at the same point, I'm like, as a coach, it's a rule. You call the check. You just got to be ready for your guy's stick to get checked.
Yeah, and that's all I'm saying. You got to be ready for it to come right back at you.
You're trying to win, so if you do that, like, you got to be ready to accept the consequences, which might be the entire opposing team's bench chirping you, like in the handshake line and down the, off the field, and you deal with that. You're probably good, but I think the hard part in general is that it's a small coaches community. I think when you get to bigger sports like basketball and football, they're a little less concerned with, all the friendships and things like that, because I think there's just a lot on the line career wise, so I'm sure there's some of that difference too. And I think that probably also, fans into the poaching discussion, men's versus women's, and, you're trying to get the best kids for your program. Like, how concerned are you with the friendships, across the coaching community?
Yeah, and I think last point, like if you're going to do it, and I mean, you did it, just own it. Like I think it's part of the rule, and I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just saying if like moving forward, and maybe it's something they talk about with their face-off guys. Like you better make sure that your stick is legal because like we have this in our back pocket. So if it's part of your plan and process, then so be it.
Next, we have the breakdown where we deep dive into certain concepts, trends, and skills that we find are interesting. First one I had was building off of Syracuse's offense. Luke Roa, I've been so impressed by his on-the-run shooting. He had, I believe, close to an 18-yarder on the run to his left hand. That wasn't a muffin, didn't really sneak by. That thing had heat on it and was a really impressive shot. Curious from you two in particular, if you've got any thoughts on general on-the-run shooting mechanics. When you look at a guy like Luke Roa, what does he do well? How do you generate that much power, right? You see some of these guys that aren't like huge guys, but they're able to get so much power and force into their shot on the run. I'm interested to hear any thoughts you have on the run shooting mechanics, but particularly Luke Roa and what he seems to do well.
Yeah, it's a great discussion. I mean, I think like I can definitely speak to what I think he does well. What I think is a little harder to figure out, and I've seen this like, even training a guy like Ben Furley, who's a freshman at Georgetown now. Like, some guys just have snap and pop to their mechanics that, creates a heavier, faster ball, and you can see guys, and that's what I think is cool about the sport. You see guys even like Cam Rubin, he's like 5'8", 5'9", maybe 5'10". I don't want to, discredit him too much, but just, tagging like 110 miles an hour, like both hands. And, Furley's like that. Roa obviously shows that pop. And so I just think there's some biomechanics and how people are built and wired that you're just not going to have everyone that can do that, and that's okay, and that's why some of those guys I think become a little more elite or have that velocity. And then I think if you can couple that with the accuracy and the consistency, that's where you could get a really great shooter, And so what I think he's doing really well is, I think for the most part, he's doing a great job of moving back to the cage, and turning the corner. And even you saw the last couple steps on that 18-yarder, his momentum's finishing back to the target, and look, there will be guys that do that don't get the same velocity on the shot. But to me, that's where it's the accuracy and the consistency and being able to replicate a shot and then your strength training and your biomechanics are what's going to help you actually get the velocity that you need to get to. But that's what I see from him. And I know that's something that he's worked on and buys into, and I think the buy-in piece of believing that on the run, right, you should be moving to your target versus fading more often than not. That's something that we've been working on with our athletes for the last 8 years.
My one takeaway, I think, Deemer, you're spot on with a lot of the stuff that you just said. We were just talking about, I guess, stick technology from a stick checking perspective with Fogos. I would love to see the type of stick and pocket that he is playing with. I would guess and bet a lot that he has a little bit more whip than a guy like, a Hiltz or a Joey Spallina. And I do think, the stick technology does matter in terms of how you string your stick. For those shooting mechanics, like there's just, if he picked up Spallina's stick, I don't think he could carry across the left, like top left and shoot the way that he did. But, his stick has a little bit more tug on it. It looks like I had actually, on the call at one point, he sailed one like he pulled it near side like way too much and missed by like 4 or 5 yards. And I was like, wow, there's got to be a lot of whip in that stick. And then turns out he's just like slinging the ball. But I wanted to also talk about that. Like, when we train kids, I do, comment on if a kid has a lot of whip or not. Because I think a lot of people can't handle having a lot of whip in their stick. And one, they're not shooting like a Luke Roa or like a guy like Ryan Brown. Like the ball is just not getting on target like that. They just think it's giving them like 10 or 15 extra miles per hour and they can't pass. Right. But it is a skill. Like Luke Roa, he might have a lot of whip in his stick and, maybe I am wrong, but it hasn't really hindered his ability to play and be like a good, teammate within the 6v6 offense. Like I haven't seen him throw a lot of balls into the ground and be an issue there. And I think it's also speaks to like his position within the offense. He's one of the only like non-Canadian like guys, he's a two-handed Dodger. Michael Leo is also a non-Canadian guy, but he's more that lefty, like slasher type. So I think it's just interesting where he fits in that offense, what they need from him. He provides such like a different dynamic. But yes, I would love to see what that stick looks like because the way he's bringing his hands all the way back and getting all that power, it's very impressive.
The stick discussion is interesting because I feel like you look at some shooters that you would think would have a ton of whip and they don't always because their hands are so good or their mechanics are so dialed. One question I have for you guys is around shooting mechanics because I notice it in really both of your games, but it kind of differs in what I think really general shooting mechanics people talk about, like getting your hands back or pushing your hands away, but it's not really pushing your hands away. Like you look at Roa shoot, his hands are pretty tight to his body right on the run. It's not like the stick's like reached away from his body, but his shoulders around and he really gets a ton of torque from his like torso rotation. And, you look at like, I think you look at you guys shoot. Deemer, you kind of shoot like that. I watch like a Ryan Brown shoot. Like his hands are, they're not far away from his body, but they're kind of loaded and torqued back with his torso rotation. I'm curious, are there any like cues or thoughts around there from generating that power with allowing your body to help with the force that your hands and arms can produce?
It's a good question. I know we were talking about this a bit when we were out in California a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes there's also finding the balance of what are the cues versus I've talked about this before, but what are the false cues? The things that lead you away from what you're trying to get versus like just leaving it quiet and then like letting a shooter or person trying to generate force like self-organize and figure it out. And so like one of the false cues I've always thought is like that 90-degree thing, like I just get my arms up and like 90 degrees and like my hands are up and away. Like up and away makes zero sense to me. I'm just going to be completely honest. Like the best cues and things that have helped me have been being comfortable and kind of even focused more on like my bottom hand not being like too far in front of my face. The more it's back, like over my back shoulder, that has been my cue. And then I do that, the back elbow, kind of like what you're talking about, Matt, kind of rests like a little bit off of my rib cage. It's not like I'm not trying to keep it too tight, but I'm not trying to like chicken wing out and have this awkward elbow positioning, And so that's where I think like if people were getting hung up on degrees of angle and this or that. I'm like, it's just stuff that you can't even measure. What tools do we have to measure that and reinforce that? I'm like, it's just not helping you get to where you need to be. And that's where I think guys are like compact, and then it generates that velocity. And anecdotally, I would just tell you, like last week, I was actually getting a golf lesson, and the guy kind of said to me, he goes, "What sport, when you're trying to swing or throw a ball, do you like want your elbow out in the way? Like everything comes from like in tight. Like as you're throwing, it's like in tight and compact." And I was like, it's actually hilarious that you say that, because that's what we've been starting to talk about more. And I don't know why those cues exist. And he was talking to me about the golf swing, like as you're back in your swing. And Steven, you played in high school, like your elbow is supposed to drop as you're swinging through and then bringing the club through. And so if that's like part of that, creating that torque and that compactness, then you shouldn't be cueing someone's elbows to be so out and extended in an uncomfortable position.
The other side, like when I say hands back, like if I watch Roa shoot, like that stick, if he's shooting overhand, the stick head is so hidden behind his helmet, like he's able to just bring it back to there. So when I'm saying that, I mean like the physical stick head. Like with my stick, I could never bring it back to that point, because as it moved forward, like it would just fly out. So like I would always shoot underhand, because the way I could hide my stick with my body was from like an underhand perspective. So I'm bringing that like behind my body, and that way I can keep it in. It's also just a more natural feel for me. But I always view that, like I was always envious of guys that could, overhand be hiding the stick so well and like kind of crank that forward and still be super accurate with it.
I was just going to say, like, that also just comes back to your position on the field, and your role on the team, and I was saying to you, Steve, like there was a point like sophomore, junior, senior year at Duke where I got no inside finishes during practice because I was playing on the perimeter. So what I could do though is I could increase gradually the whip in my stick and how the sidewalls were strung to create more of that mid-high pocket and that hold, because that's where I was. And all I needed to do was make sure that my forward passing, I thought, was the hardest part. And I actually felt like my first or second year pro, I could shoot twos great, like even with Ryan's stick, but I couldn't deliver consistent forward balls when someone slid to me. And that's when I actually started dialing back to the pocket that I currently have. And I just think that's a huge thing that people need to keep thinking about. What are the roles? So like I could test that whip in that pocket, and it certainly evolved over high school and college, but it takes time, and where you are on the field really matters. I don't know that it would have been the same if I was, playing like, more at X or anything like that.
Last piece here, and obviously you guys can speak so much better to all the nuance of shooting mechanics and how your stick influences that. One thing that I've been really interested in is but just in general movement mechanics and, even throwing with long poles. And I follow a lot of quarterback accounts. Jordan Palmer posted a great video about passing with quarterbacks. And it made a lot of sense to me for all of movement, where basically movement and throwing is force transfer and sequencing, right? You're transferring force, and through your body off the ground, the force comes off the ground. You're not, if you were in the air, right, and just floating, you tried to shoot, you would get no power on that shot, really. You have to push off the ground, you generate force, and then you have to sequence that force off the ground into your release, right? So then what we're talking about really in your mechanics is one, how you generate that force, or how you push off the ground. Demon, your over the cone stuff, right? Generating that force in the direction you want to go. If you're fading to the sideline, you're not going to get a lot of force to the goal. Your force is going to be going away. So you have to fight that. So getting to the goal. And then you're sequencing, right? How efficiently can you let that force go off the ground through your body into your release? I think one thing I've noticed is when you stay compact, to your point, compact, you allow that force to transfer through your body and not get broken at different points in your body, where you then just have to yank your arms through and get it all from that, right? So I think you look at these great shooters, these great quarterbacks, they're not overstriding, they're not overreaching, they're pretty compact in how they allow that force to transfer through their body. And I notice that when I see shooters is they're pretty tight and they're pretty loaded, like they're not really far away. But then the last piece of the sequence is your arm extends and is that lever, that whip. So once your arm does end up kind of releasing a little bit, like you're talking about that golf swing, but it all starts though with a really compact force transfer and sequencing through the body. The reason I say it's just something I've been really interested in. So I watch a lot of shooters now. I watch you guys teach. I try to teach our long poles to throw, because when you teach a young defender how to throw an overpass, well, you need to be able to generate force and sequence, because they're not strong enough to throw it sometimes, and those balls go all over the place if they just try to muscle it with their arms. So just kind of an opinion there as we wrap up. I don't know if either of you guys have any additional thoughts on that before we move on.
It's kind of like when you watch guys shoot for the fastest shot competition, like they'll take a crow hop or two, and then you'll see some guys like skip off their back foot and then land and shoot. And you just think, like, in a game, that just is taking more time, so it's not that functional. So guys that can take a balanced, quick shuffle, crow hop, whatever you want to call it, and then shift that weight from back foot to front foot, and that front leg like locks out, that's, you're using that front leg as like that, crux to like this motion, and then everything comes through. And the more balanced you are, the more you're going to be on target while still delivering the pop and not sacrificing power. And I think in our sport, sacrificing a mile an hour or two for deception and consistency is worth it, but if you're so focused on just the numerical value of miles per hour, I think most people, like most young kids we've worked with, get so focused on that. And that's not ultimately what scores goals time and time again. And I think, Matt, like another good drill for like your sequencing you're talking about, like one we've always done is the pop shooting, where you pop out, catch, and then you take your shuffle back. But the one I love that you can really see if kids can catch and release is where you just take one step. Like you pop away, your momentum's going away, you catch loaded, and in one step you plant and then take the step back to the cage. And that's where you can see how kids can really transfer their weight from back foot to front foot and sequence the timing of catching the ball and then getting it out in a smooth way, and I think that's actually a really difficult drill for a lot of high school and younger kids, especially even offhand if they're doing it well stronghand. But I think it's a good way to like teach some of that and see if they're balanced and getting their weight back over their front foot.
Yeah, I think we can probably wrap up here with one last piece. It's just, we talk about defensive footwork. I'm just getting an idea as you're speaking. Efficiency of movement is everything, right? So like Deemer, you're talking about being efficient, because if you're generating force off the ground, you have to generate it quickly. So if you get a quick push, how efficiently can you generate the force and how efficiently can you get the ball out? It's the same with defensive footwork, right? You might be the fastest guy in the world, but if I can't efficiently push from right to left and I have to turn and run, well, that's going to take more steps. And also now I'm overcommitted, I'm overexposed. You as a Dodger can read me. So I think efficiency of movement is a huge piece, from whether it's shooting, whether it's teaching defensive footwork, sliding. If you're a coach or a player, someone to focus on is not doing everything as hard and as fast as you can, but can you clean it up and do it efficiently? All right, we're going to move on here to keep it going. Guys, I think we pushed to looking ahead. Steven, if you want to run us through similar style of 2-minute drill, what we're looking at this coming weekend in the men's and women's games.
Yeah, so some big games this weekend. Big Saturday slate for men's, and the games are a little bit more scattered. The first weekend, all the games are at 1 o'clock. I think we have some 12, some 1, some 2. We've got Penn at Georgetown, Hopkins at Loyola, Princeton at Penn State. That's a top 10 matchup. And I believe that was the first round game in 2023 NCAA tournament. That was a big game there. Harvard at Providence. Providence now a top 20 team. We'll get our first look at Harvard. And then Syracuse at Maryland, top 10 matchup. I don't believe that Syracuse has beaten Maryland since 2009 is, I think, the last time that Syracuse has won. So that's a huge game there. And then on the women's front, Syracuse at Maryland as well, UNC at Florida, Michigan at Yale, Virginia at Princeton, and then 1 versus 2 BC at Northwestern. That's obviously a huge matchup, a rematch of last year's national championship game.
I'm excited for Harvard Providence. I'm curious to see, that's a good test for Harvard to start. I'm curious to see their team. I think also Providence coming off a couple wins and, creating some of that chemistry, I think will present a good challenge, especially for the Harvard D. So I think that will be good. And I'm excited to see the Ivies, back in the mix. Princeton at Penn State's intriguing. I think Penn State's looked good early. And, I'm eager to see the Tiger offense getting out there, mixing it up. So, and then on the women's side for me, CUSAT Maryland, that was a great game last year. And then BC traveling to Northwestern. Northwestern won this game on the road last year. Obviously, back-to-back championship game rematch. So a lot of competition there. And then, BC returns a lot on the offensive end. Northwestern graduated two of its stars, but Madison Taylor's quickly, putting herself in that Tawarton discussion again, as she was a finalist last year as a sophomore. So, how does she continue to take the reins in these big matchups?
And just kind of building off what we talked about 2 weeks ago with Providence, they last week assisted almost 80% of their goals again. So just a team that I think is really interesting and how they're able to score goals. You look at a Penn Georgetown, two probably more defensively heavy teams this year, where I think Penn, as far as the Ivy League goes, you look at a lot of those teams probably more offensively heavy. I think Penn is expected to have a very solid defense, which they showed they did last year. And Georgetown's kind of been that way too, where maybe figuring some things out on offense, but solid defensively. Whereas I think Princeton, Penn State, maybe you're looking at a higher scoring game where Penn State's been putting up goals. Matt Trainor's had a great, start to the year so far. And as we know, Princeton has a ton of talent on the offensive end. So excited to see the Ivy League roll in. Syracuse, Maryland, I think to me is just the marquee one, but a lot of good games this weekend as the Ivy League gets going.
Syracuse, Maryland, unfortunately on Big Ten Plus, to follow up from our conversation last week. That was another thing I've been seeing of people being annoyed by, but is what it is, and just got to find a way to watch it.
Big Ten Plus is one of the logins that I've held, and unfortunately, I realize I've been paying for it all year, even though I only use it 3 months. I went to log in 2 weeks ago, and I had an account still active, and I was like, "Great, that means I've just paid for this all summer and fall." All right, let's wrap it up here. We got one final segment, one that I think all of us really enjoy, and that's our players' perspective. We can hit it quickly here. Doesn't need to be a lot. One thing that a lot of players are focused on right now is across the country, either tryouts are happening, they just happened, or are coming up in the near future. Last week we talked a little bit about standing out. I'd like to go a layer deeper here with you guys, and maybe just quick thoughts on players looking to make a team or players that have made a team and are looking to earn playing time. Maybe just some thoughts around how to do that. A lot of times it can be kids can feel hopeless, or maybe they feel a coach doesn't like them, or maybe they just struggle to figure out how to earn that playing time because they see a player in front of them and they don't see a path to it. And as we all know, most players that are on a team, they want to play. So that can be a real struggle. Guessing or wondering, maybe Deemer, if you want to provide any thoughts off the start, an approach on a player either looking to make a roster or once they make it, how to go about trying to earn playing time if they're not a guy that's just clearly the guy for their spot.
One thing that, kind of comes right to mind as maybe a less traditional approach, but I think is extremely valuable, is go find some of the older players on the team or in the program that you can emulate, that you can learn from. And, I think each, guy or girl can think about for themselves how they want to approach that. But, this is such a good opportunity for someone to take you under their wing and give their perspective on, hey, this is how you do it. This is what coach wants to see. When I was in your shoes, here are some of the things that I struggle with, and here's what I did about them. And I think that can be done in a way that it doesn't feel like you're sucking up to the coach. It doesn't feel like you're asking questions after practice that coach can't really give you an answer right away or whatever it may be. And I think it allows you to build relationships with your teammates that, hey, if they see something in you and they take to that, well, then they're going to help you along. They're going to give you that feedback. And I just think we in high school, we idolize those older players and look up to those older players on the team. And those are the people that we want to be like. So pick the right ones, pick the ones that are motivated, dedicated, like you feel like have good standing in the program. And do what they do, look to spend time with them, look to, shoot after practice with them, or, hey, maybe they, invite you to come get Chipotle, right? Like Matt, like we always were getting Chipotle after Loyola practice, and like getting the, ride with some of the older players. Like that was important. Like those were important times. And I think those guys, made a big difference for us when we were sophomores and kind of figuring it out. And I know it's the same when we got to college. So I think that's something that can be really valuable.
One thing is we can provide advice. Like one piece of advice might be, if you're not playing, go, have a conversation with the coach about why you're not playing. But there's more to it than that, because we're coaches and we've been, and players have played. You can't just go ask the coach, like, coach, why am I not playing? Coach, why am I not playing? If it's not authentic and you're not doing the things you need to do, if you're really committed and doing everything you believe you can be doing to play, and you're grinding day in and day out, and that's actually true, then yes, you can have a constructive conversation with your coach where it's not just about, coach, why am I not playing? But coach, what does the team need from me? I would love to play. I understand maybe that's not possible, but I would really love to work my way on the field. What does the team need from a guy like me or a girl like me? And what could I do to add enough value that you would want to play me on game day? Right. In an authentic way. And you can't have that conversation every week, right? It has to be one or two times. It has to be authentic. And I think first, I don't think it's a bad thing to want to play. I think it's a great thing to want to earn a starting spot. I think that's awesome. In the hierarchy, though, if you're going to be a great teammate first, the conditions can't be, if I don't play, this sucks and I'm out, right? You're on a team. Your job is to be a great teammate no matter what. You don't get to play that year, you still got to be a great teammate. You get to play, you still have to be a great teammate. So I think that's really important context as we're looking through this lens, where everybody defines their experience by like, oh, I don't get to play lefty attack, I don't get to do what I want to do. Well, lacrosse is a team sport, and the conditions of it, what really makes it so great is when you're on a team, you commit to being a great teammate first, and then you do everything you can so that being a great teammate means being a great player on the team and having impact. And I think when you start to decouple those and you just want to be a player that has impact, and you separate that from being a great teammate, there's a lot of stress and struggle where we're just feeling anxious about not getting what we want. Once again, I think it's awesome to have goals of starting, to have goals of having a great year, to have goals of being successful. But I think it's so important, so very important, that culturally you want to be a great teammate first, and that trumps the other things.
If you can look at yourself in the mirror at the end of tryouts or at the end of everything and say, you did everything you could, like you can go to sleep that night, and be like, hey, I did everything I could. I'll get back to work. I'll re-strategize, whatever, or I'm doing everything I can. It's not working out. Let me figure it out. That's, I think, the mindset that you need to shift to versus, hey, I did X, Y, Z. Why am I not getting this? It's not that simple, because there's kids 1, 2, 3 years older than you that have all done X, Y, Z too. And a lot of them have waited their turn, and other people have shifted positions or found other roles or other ways to make an impact because they want it that bad. So there's always more. There's always more to give. There's always more to chase. So keep tapping into that next layer, and you got to ask yourself, like, how bad do you actually want to do this thing? And I think that will lead you to, the watering hole, so to speak, of all the answers and things that are going to help you get to where you want to go.
I think a good question, if you want to stress test yourself on, are you team first, or are you really truly prioritizing being a great teammate, is how would you feel if your coach asked you to switch positions, right? If your coach said, hey, you're a long play, I want you to play short stick D midi. Hey, you're an offensive midi, I want you to play short stick D midi. Hey, you're an attack man, I want you to play midfield. Hey, you're this, I want you to play that. How would that make you feel? And that'll kind of answer the question of, how do you see this whole experience? And I get, once again, I get maybe wanting to do one thing over another and having that conversation. But to me, that is a great experience. Is it about what you can provide for the team, or is it about how you want to do it and how you want you to be on the team? Because if everybody has the mindset that I want to do it my way, you really don't have much of a team there. It's really more of a everybody wants to do their own thing in a group. To me, that's a good thought. It's not perfect. It's a good thought exercise to have about how you're viewing your experience. The last thing I'll say is just to Deemer, to your point, like success just being, if you have the right intentions of what you want and what you're going after, and you give it everything that you have and you authentically do that, the outcome really shouldn't define how you view success, because otherwise we're going to be disappointed. Right. So and I think it's more than just, we all know the guys that shoot every day after practice and they're still not getting what they want. You have to challenge yourself more than that. Like, is shooting after practice, your sidearm step down, what you need to be doing? So it's not just doing work. It's kind of pulling back and being, am I doing everything I can to pursue what I want? If so, am I going after the right target? And if that's the case, playing time shouldn't define success, because you're going to be a great teammate and you're going to add value and people are going to respect you. They're going to want to be around you if that's the case. So just a couple frameworks to think about it. If that's something, anxiety you're having, or trying to assess your intentions, maybe a few thought exercises or ways to approach it.
Awesome. Well, hey, I think that's a great place to end today's show. Awesome stuff. We appreciate you tuning in. If you have feedback on the segments, what you like, what you didn't like, if there's anything that you'd want to hear more specifically, please let us know. We've got our contact information on our website, and otherwise, looking forward to a great slate of games. Excited to keep watching and covering. A lot to look forward to, and like we mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, we have a weekly thought newsletter that comes out every Friday. It's free. We have Coach's Corner that's coming out every other Sunday. And then Adam Lombardi has done a great job with our On the Run breakdown of the recap of what's happening in the past weekend. That's coming out every Tuesday. So we'll put those links in the comments and description, and appreciate you all tuning in. Guys, great job today.